So I'm delighted to be moderating this panel. My compliments to the organizers of this conference. It's been terrific. My first time here, so I'm very glad to be here. And we just heard from Michael Green, who gave us some great insights, particularly around GDP not being the marcher, not being the drum always that we have to march to, but that policies do make a difference and should make a difference, particularly in this area. Much of yesterday's discussion traced sentiments about the India's economy. And one of those sentiments focused hard on the importance of integrating the social dimensions in the India's growth story. After all, those dimensions, those social dimensions, are really what touch people, the rank and file as well as the leadership. And the ideas that were talked about yesterday ranged from changing the changing dominance of the agricultural sector, the engagement of women, the number and quality of jobs that can address and catalyze India's young demographic, the quality of the workforce, and the special emphasis in particular yesterday was improving learning outcomes, so education. This panel is going to really take up that integration, how and where it can happen effectively. And I think Michael really set the stage nicely, both in the macro and in the particulars. So I thought we'll go down the panel. Each one will take 3 to 5 minutes. We've got a shorter time frame than we thought we were going to have. So I'm going to ask you to speak quickly, maybe 50 words a minute or 50 words a second rather than 50 words a minute. And we'll start, I think, with Ramesh. Each of you have a program with a bio, so I won't take the time to introduce each. But we'll start with Ramesh on agriculture, then we'll go to Terrence C. and from London, and then we'll come to you, Robert, and then Michael, if you'll bring up the trail, and please interact with one another, and then we'll turn to the audience for 5 to 10 minutes of Q&A, and really encourage your interaction. I'd like to have a very active, energized, interactive panel. So let's start with you, Ramesh, 3 minutes if you could, and talk fast.
Okay. I feel that India's story in both economic and social field is really very, very fascinating, and there are very interesting reasons underlying this. I would like to begin with that when new Prime Minister in 2014 came to power, he started giving slogans which were totally different than earlier motivation and slogans. Like he said from Red Fort in his first speech, I don't want incremental step, I want transformative step. So the net result of those, you have heard so many presentations since yesterday, that India is not only performing, India is transforming. So I would like to share with you 10 points which according to me in the priority, and sometimes we don't pay much attention to this.
Ramesh, could I just interrupt you for a second? Could you give us the top 5 of the 10?
Okay. So, no, I will stop after 3 minutes.
All right. Okay. All right.
First thing is, in India, there used to be filth everywhere, there used to be garbage everywhere. Nobody was paying any attention to cleanliness. So he first came with this slogan, Swachh Bharat, Clean India. And that slogan was not restricted to government department, it became a mass movement. So as a result, you see today's city and city of the past, really you see the sea changes. But these are the basic things which nobody was paying attention. Then secondly, again from the Red Fort in his speech, when he talked about the importance of toilet, in his speech he expressed pain of the women in the Indian society who are waiting for darkness to come so that they can go to field and they can go for nature's call. You imagine the situation. Yeah. So then he gave the call for toilets, that every house will have toilets, and the campaign to change the behavior of people, Darwaja Band. Many people were not using that facility. Then in case of health, they came with the Ayushman Bharat. The poor people who earlier could not afford to go for surgeries, costly treatment, So every family was provided that they can use ₹500,000 for their treatment in any of the approved hospital. So that is something which made a big difference to health. Then after that, financial inclusion, Jan Dhan account, not only for benefit transfer, certain section of economic community like Rediwala, Patdiwala, to whom nobody paid attention, who were taking loan from private money lenders at the rate of 40%, 50%. They were provided credit at 10%, 12%. So that was another step which was taken. And new approach toward existing schemes which were not showing results. Since you mentioned agriculture, people will be expecting something from me related to agriculture. In India, between 91 and 2014, thousands of crores of rupees were spent on medium and major irrigation, but there was not an increase of 1,000 hectare area under public irrigation. I have a paper on it. So millions of dollars spent, but not even 1 hectare under irrigation was not added because attention was not paid to last mile obstacles and last mile connectivity. He came with new scheme, Pradhan Mantri Krishi Sinchai Yojana, under which this attention was paid, and the sector got transformed. During the last 7 years, we have 7 percentage point increase in area under irrigation from 47% in 2017 to now 54%. So like this, you touch any scheme, soil health card, ENAM, etc. There were big changes.
Could we stop at agriculture since that's your specific area, and there'll be an opportunity to come back to that with the audience? Can we go to you, Terence, please, and give us your context?
Very good.
If you would, please.
I will. Thank you very much. I'll keep it short
Thank you,
as
Ramesh.
well. I only want to actually mention. So first, thank you very much for inviting me here. I guess it would be very, very arrogant of me to actually claim that I know anything about India, especially when I'm in front of a lot of experts here. What I do want to do, however, is to provide some sort of a cautionary tale drawing from the lessons in China, right, as to what not to do. And I'm not entirely surprised when I actually saw that the GDP is going that way, but SPI is only pretty much flat. I think one of there are 3 things I believe that China has got it wrong with the benefit of hindsight. The first one is the blind pursuit of GDP. Right. There are so many things that you could get wrong with just a singular focus on GDP. But what we could see right now is overcapacity. Right? Overcapacity, if you look at, for instance, the strong reliance on property, property development requires a lot of steel. Right? But the problem is, the moment the property market disappeared, the steel industry suffered. Right? So overcapacity, what to do with the steels? Try to actually forbid all of them off, send them all to the U.S. Of course, that's the reasons why the tax is there, right? The import tax. But what do? Right? You can't actually transform the structure of the economy overnight. So that's one. Second thing I want to actually mention is the fact that we talk about education every now and then. China did actually put a lot of money into education, whether it is primary or all the way up to tertiary. The problem, I believe, is that there was not enough creation of high-value jobs. A couple of years ago, me and my partner over there, we were actually looking at a report, and we're trying to actually write an article. And what we have found is that a lot of the jobs, most of the jobs are actually created in China are basically those jobs that you only need high school degrees to complete, right? High school qualification. And the reason is simple, because all of these jobs will be dry, logistics, will be catering, right? But high value jobs, there's still not enough, right? And it actually hinders the fact that how China can actually really move into a service-based economy, right? So that's the second. The third one is corruption and governance. Now, I don't have to actually talk about corruption, in depth. But what I do want to actually say, very importantly, is the fact that I think one of the biggest problem right now we could see in China that is really actually hindering the attempt to recover, is the fact that almost everything is ideology driven, right? When I use the term ideology, what I meant was, the fact that the party want to actually stay in power, right? Now, and one way to do it is, of course, to keep on bashing the private sectors, right? And yet, the private sectors are actually is one of the most important economic pillars of the country, right? Just to actually give you some idea how important it is, the former president, he actually said that the private sector in China represents the 50, 60, 70, 80, and 90%. It pays 50% of the taxes of the country. It accounts for 60% of the GDP growth. 70% of the tax sectors are in private, 70% of the private sector is private. 80% of the employment that's is going into the private sector, and 90% of the new business creations are in the private sector. And yet, due to the pursuit, ideological pursuit of the country, they keep on actually threatening to take away, confiscating the private property ownership assets, and two, it's the fact that they actually keep on saying that private sector is actually a bad idea. So much so, my last point, and that is they're trying now to reintroduce something that actually happened in the 60s, 70s by introducing communist members into private companies in order to keep an eye on how business would be actually run. So I think there are there are quite a lot that China can offer as what not to do as lessons.
Right. So we all benefit from mentors and role models, and also those models that tell us how not to do things. And in what you say, there's a lot to the cautionary tale Michael raised in what China has done and the direction it's going. Robert, let's go to you and hear your perspective from the University of San Diego. Please.
It's pretty amazing to be here. This is the building where I received my PhD, so it's kind of like coming home. And, it's just an impressive group. I was here last year, but I thank Amit and Richard for inviting me back here again and being on this panel, which I'm sure you're about to hear the least interesting comments. I want to talk about a cautionary tale we're talking here much about social transformation and how we affect social transformation, what we can expect from it. And I'm going to talk really quickly about, we've seen in the United States 2 large social transformations in my adult lifetime. And one of them was deliberate, caused by policy, and the other was unintentional, caused by that transformation. And the big change was in 1982, when we broke up the conglomerates, stopped industry-government cooperation, so-called Reagan Revolution, empowered the financial system. Financial system was 2% of the economy in 1980. It's 9% now. And we got a huge transformation. We closed down all the factories in Michigan, closed the factories throughout the Midwest, caused huge disruptions. Movies were made about it. That was a deliberate policy choice. The coast became enabled, technology was enabled, finance grew on the East Coast, technology grew on the West Coast, the middle was abandoned. That led to the second large change that we've seen. Sometime after the social index, progress index was published, we had the election in 2016 here, where we got an irrational reaction to that change. Because for 30 years, that middle portion of the country that had been abandoned by those policies reacted angrily and are still reacting angrily. It suggests 2 things. One, we can do policies, but there are often unintended effects, partially because we don't think carefully about the social relationships that are engendered and part of that change and who's benefiting from it. The policies now advocated by the so-called reactionary right here in the United States, which is very powerful. It's about half the country. Very powerful. We can't do climate change legislation in the United States because of the power, the political power that's engendered. They are actually advocating changes that are inimical, we believe, to their interests, and which are creating huge economic disparities in the United States. Michael talked about regions which are poor close to each other. We're here in Palo Alto. Right next to us is East Palo Alto. I was born in Detroit. Right next to it was, right next to Mount Clemens was some of the poorest neighborhoods in the world. The whole point about this is that if we're going to have social change, we have to be careful and understand how carefully the first word is, social, is important to what we do. If you look again at Michael's index, and I'm sorry to keep harping on it, but I've studied it for years, it's fascinating. Look at the countries at the top, look at the countries at the bottom. There's a Germanic language bias in that list. Every country that has a Germanic language is doing very, very well. It suggests, not the German language helps you, it suggests that the cultural reasons for progress are very important and have to be engaged. So what I'm urging India government people to think about is the social processes that are going on in India. Study it carefully. Don't try to be a billionaire country. Don't try to be a financial country. Look what we did, look what we got. There's political instability in the United States. Look into your opportunities. Maybe the government needs to drive on climate change, spend tons of money, create demand for entrepreneurs. Don't try to create a supply for entrepreneurs. But it needs to look and move carefully, because in deliberate policy will generate unanticipated effects, and you want better ones than we got. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. Michael, let's go to you. And if I might say, we've heard from Terence and Robert on the importance of being aware of the context and the social relationships that policies can engender. And from Ramesh, we heard some of the very positive things that are happening, and they're significant. I mean, India wouldn't have the momentum it has today in its growth story. Your index speaks to governments in large part, the role of the private sector. How do you parse that in your index, and then in light of what we've just heard on this panel, if you can come at it from that direction as well as the policy public side?
Yeah, that's great. Maybe just one thing I say, Bob's kind of inspired me to say this is, there's a cautionary tale from America. In 1990, the United States had the 7th highest GDP per capita in the world and was the 8th highest level of social progress. In 2020, the US had the 8th highest GDP per capita, had held its place on economically, and had fallen to 31st place on social progress. The US over the last 30 years has had an relatively inclusive model of development, and somehow it's blown it up and thrown it away. I mean, it's a catastrophic failure. So there's something to learn, and things can change.
That's right.
And that's, I think, some of the things that Bob talked about are part of that. So I wanted to put that on the table. In terms of private sector, I mean, I think, we worked with Mike Porter very much because Mike thought that this was stuff that was relevant for business. So there's a couple of things. One is, I think, if you're thinking about, country risk, then actually lack of investment in social progress is something that's a risk to businesses. And again, the Germanic language bias. I think there's a case of those Nordic countries have invested in equity that has then repaid them economically, that has helped them to drive on to these very high levels of social progress. So lack of social progress actually is an economic risk that investors should be thinking about. That affects investors in sovereign bonds, but also thinking about where you're locating direct investment more broadly. Supply chains, it can also affect. So therefore, businesses should be incorporating this data into how they're thinking about countries and regions. And we're actually seeing social progress index data now being used in more and more ratings and analyst reports around countries because of this materiality. I think the second one is for businesses, is thinking then also about the growing pressure for businesses to report on their social impact. Particularly the new EU regulations that have come through that are really pushing any business that has a footprint in the EU to account for what it's doing. And I think businesses actually do a pretty terrible story. I think too often they focus on compliance and also talking about the bad things they don't do, rather than actually talking about the good things they do. And I think the contribution to business is enormous. And I think business could do a lot better in telling its story about how it's making better societies and how some businesses are actually better than others. And then thinking about which businesses we want to grow and attract. And also, I think to Terence's point, which jobs do we want to create? We're seeing increasingly that the unemployment rate is becoming a very unreliable indicator of social outcomes because the quality of work matters a lot more than the quantity of work. And indeed, to Bob, your point, we've done a social progress index for just down the road, San Jose. And you see huge variation, neighborhood by neighborhood, in levels of social progress. A lot of that's linked to the quality of work, and the access to the quality of work is often linked to public infrastructure. Lack of access to public transportation, lack of access to childcare. So thinking in that integrated way about the social infrastructure that allows people to succeed, business to succeed in an inclusive way is absolutely critical.
Right, terrific. Just a note on the climate change regulations issued by regulators, of course. Compliance is their area. And the focus is getting to the risk to tell investors what the potential is for risk to these non-financial external factors like climate change. So just on that score. But I'd like to sort of come back to the four of you, before we go to the audience for our last few minutes. The title of our section is economic and social issues, dimensions, and I add their integration, because that's been a large part of our conversation the past day, with an emphasis on education and jobs and upscaling those jobs. But I'd like to ask you, in your opinion, we have four of us who are not Indian. We have a representative, Niti Ayog. Is there an opportunity for India to really exercise a paradigm change in how they integrate the social dimension in the economic growth story? And we might start with you, Ramesh, and then just go down the line briefly, and then we'll turn it over to the audience.
It is already visible if you analyze successive budget of the government. They have very carefully calibrated growth and equity. Like for growth side, you look at capital expenditure. There is a huge increase in capital expenditure. At the same time, you look at welfare measures. India is giving 40% of staple food requirement to 800 million people free of cost. Nowhere in the world you meet 40% requirement of staple food without any payment, without any kind of thing. So I think the biggest success or biggest positive side of this government, to my mind, is that in today's world you can't completely ignore this social protection or welfare aspect and focus on growth, nor you can do other way right. So they have maintained this balance in a very, very calibrated and nice manners.
Right.
So you find that the kind of social protection and welfare schemes which are there, they have expanded over time.
Right.
But not at the cost of growth story. They are happening.
Yeah, that's a very important point, that sense of balance, because what I've heard very interestingly in this conference is an emphasis on not too much regulation. I heard someone say last night, if the government gives us one regulation, they should take down 12. But let's go down the line. Thank you, Ramesh. That
Thanks.
Balance is terrific. Yeah.
Thanks. There's a couple of things, and just I'll be brief, but first of all, let's just really briefly do regulations. The most regulated part of the United States is the Bay Area. It's also the highest area of technology entrepreneurship. Just keep that in mind. Regulations have positive benefits and actually produce things. This is very, very important. Social change has to occur, and India has the brains, the government, and the power to make it happen, and I think it could happen in climate change. Climate change in particular is an interesting problem. All the private efforts in the world on climate change, all the effort to take carbon out, reducing carbon about 500,000 tons a year in the atmosphere, We need to reduce 15 trillion tons of carbon in the atmosphere per year in order to reduce temperatures by. That will not happen with private efforts. That will only happen with government efforts, changing power plants, changing laws on internal combustion engines, changing the social structure, the way people get to work. This cannot happen privately. This has to happen through the government. And India, I think, at this particular historical thing, is at the crux where it can make the decision that we as a nation will lead this change and lead this transformation. That will generate far more economic thing in progress than investment, reducing regulations, or any of the standard prescriptions of the 1980s.
Thank you. Terence.
I have a slightly different spin. I mean, I fully agree with you, with the climate. And also, I fully agree with you with the fact that India has got the capabilities and resources to do, to be at the world stage. Once again, I'm drawing on the lessons from China. If you look at China, so yesterday, one of the things that got me the most is the fact that there is no one single global brand from India. Right? Now, probably is up and coming, probably is on its way. But if I were to actually look at China, we do have China. China has got a couple of global brands, right? Including TikTok, ByteDance, and now what is very popular in the US, Temu, right? The problem, I think, is that it has to be, India would have to do the same thing with a slightly different spin, and that is do it in a way that is not at the expense of the social development in the, in China. If you look at Temu, one of the very reasons why it is such a rising star, especially in the US, we in the UK we're still very, very slow in taking on Temu. But here, apparently, I was it's very, very obsessed. People are obsessed with it because they're obsessed with the price, right? And how ridiculously low price things are.
Yeah, right.
But where do you actually there must be some sort of a catch with low prices, and of course, it is all coming at the expense of the working conditions in in a manufacturing country, i.e. China.
Yeah.
So I think it is India has got the ability to both establish a brand, but not at the expense of the a social not paying it with social costs.
Yeah. Let me ask you though, Terence. It's not branding in the conventional sense, but couldn't we think of India's IT sector as a global collective brand? I mean, the Wipros, the Mahindras, the Tata.
Yep.
That group, Infosys.
I was thinking about that too.
Yeah.
I think what India is probably missing, and that is, if we were to draw on the analogy with the US, is that there is no retail technologies. There is no technologies that retail consumers can actually use. Whereas in the US, it's the Apple and the Meta and just down the road, right?
Okay.
So I think if India could actually move from more of a B2B big tech giant to a B2C tech giant, I think it will actually open up a lot more opportunities for the country.
Right. And one thing we heard yesterday was a lot of emphasis on that startup strategy of developing the idea in India but bringing it to the U.S. market. So that corridor becomes really important.
That will be, yeah.
Michael, you want to bring the elephant home for us on the panel, and then we'll go to the audience, and Pranjal will be our first, so please.
I was going to say what Bob said better than I was going to say it, so I'm going to shut up and give other people a chance.
By the way, it's important to note that we have a lot of technology here, and all these companies met at Facebook. This is the area of the United States with the most profound inequality.
Yes.
The most profound inequality. When I grew up in Michigan, it was young people that mowed the lawns. When the people mow the lawns now, is a poorer class of people here. And so we have to be aware. You don't want to make the mistakes the United States made.
Pranjal?
Thanks for all this. I want to challenge Michael on your social progress report. I think it'll sort of get everybody
Can you
excited
speak up
now.
a little bit?
Yeah. Michael, you just casually said something about the information and communication sector, saying that, it's down in the dumps after years of actually improving access of communications and online digital access. And then you quote the World Press Index, which is actually a survey of perception rather than based on facts, which I think really undermines that specific point, because I would argue that the world, I mean, media freedom in India is no better or worse than in the year before the current government, point one. In fact, I would argue that it's better because of digital media. So many YouTubers, social media accounts, and online platforms are abusing and questioning the government every minute of the day. And I find this interesting because even yesterday, Dr. Bardhan said that billionaires own all of Indian media. But if you look at the facts, 6 corporations own 90% of US media, which is very, very stunning. And it's not recent. They've actually, and a few years ago, it was only 30% of the media was owned by these 6 corporations. In UK, 3 publishers own 90% of print media and 40% of online media. And US does not even allow foreign media to enter more than 20% and take a stake in a company. UK is actually arguing against allowing foreign media to be there. And then there are these reports of India throwing out foreign media, et cetera, et cetera. So I would argue that in your social progress report, it would be helpful to revise it and look at the facts on ground rather than an index which has been, unquestioned and its legitimacy is not accepted by most. Thank you.
Michael,
Just a
do
quick
you
one,
want
Michael.
to, or do you want to take it offline? Oh, go ahead.
It's just very quick. So the access to information component includes a range of things of access to the internet, mobile phone subscriptions, etc. And broadly what we've seen is that's shot up over the world over the years, and it's starting to slow down. So what we see with India is you're absolutely right. It's the indicator on press freedom, and we use the World Press Freedom Index as the indicator on that one. Yeah, people don't like it. I'm familiar with this criticism in Indian audiences. It's one indicator across the whole piece of that component, and we'll have to agree to disagree on its reliability.
Thank you.
Work in progress. Please, back there. Thank you for delivering the microphone so quickly. Appreciate it. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rahul Shah, social impact consultant based in Bombay. One question, if you overlay the SPI index across probably the aspirational districts in India, you'll probably see some interesting kind of insights and perspectives. So my question for Rameshji, what are some of the kind of elements of the aspirational districts program that you're particularly bullish and optimistic about? And what are some of the things that keep you up at night when it comes to improving SPI in these aspirational districts? Thank you.
Again, aspirational district, to my mind, is the result of special attention paid to bottom, marginalized, and excluded. If you look excluded, nobody gave so much emphasis on gender as you find it now. Nari Shakti, women can join army, other forces, so that equal opportunity kind of thing. Similarly, marginalized category. Earlier, we were treating border village as India's last village. But Prime Minister said they are not the village where India ends. They are the village where India starts. So it is a border villages are our first villages. We will develop them accordingly, not that they are the last villages, therefore things will go there at last. So similarly, this aspirational districts and aspirational blocks, that they were at the bottom. So the thinking was that if they are developed, then you will find that overall average of country will also develop. So this is all result of new kind of approaches, and outcome is not captured in many of the conventional indicators, especially the indicators which are developed in the West without taking into account specificities of India. Like I was surprised yesterday when Professor Vardhan talked about employment, that it is self-employment which is increasing, jobs are not increasing. Prime Minister gave emphasis, I want people in this country not to be job seeker but job providers. And things have moved in that direction. You improve skill of people, you give them money, you give them capital, they start their own business, they start offering employment to others, their family members. So this is how the largest increase in the people who are joining workforce are women, because many of them don't want to go outside their home. Now they have opportunity to work in a small business within their homes. But these kind of indicators are never captured in the conventional indicators. So I think India need to do lot of work to develop their own indicators. That is very, very important, and we have seen it. Like one indicator, in India, so many % people hungry. Jan Reg and Deaton came with a paper in India, 70% people are hungry. They don't even consume minimum dietary energy intake. My counter is coming next month. I told them India's dietary pattern is different. Most of the people to whom you call hungry, it's a voluntary hunger. Like you look at the top 10% income decile, you find 30% of people there are not consuming what you call is minimum dietary energy requirement. They don't perceive it as there any deficiency of energy. So if you apply those conventional indicators, you will not capture what is happening in India. There are cultural specificities, there are so many other kind of specificities. I think we need to develop our own indicator.
Over here.
Thank you, Marsha. I think you forgot to mention HCL Technologies when you mentioned the list of.
Apologies. Thank you very much. Of course. Yeah, you're exactly right.
I wanted to pick up from what Terence said, and I'm steering away from India. I will not talk. I wanted to ask a question on the US and the UK. And applying that cautionary trail example that Terence talked about. So in '82, you said, Robert, that US began to break conglomerates and break away from corporations, and therefore, I guess, embraced the market much more. AT&T breakup, and market became unfettered. And then you got all the problems with the market, including, I think, the global financial crisis, aspects of greed, and and then in the UK, you got Brexit, right? Probably a culmination of what the market was doing to these economies. So, and I didn't hear either of you talk about, when you mentioned the cautionary trail, what the sort of boundaries of the market can be, and whether there is some introspection within, UK and the US about the role of the market and how to address it.
Sure. Can I start? And then
Of course, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. We do need to think carefully about that. One of the things that's important to understand is that markets don't exist without regulation. There's no such thing as a market without the police. And you can imagine this very, very simply. Put a table out where there's nobody around with something valuable on it and try to sell the product that you're trying to sell with nobody around. What's the price of that commodity? Simple. It goes to the first person with a gun who wants to steal it. A market doesn't exist unless the police are around to regulate that market. And what we forgot in this market reform, and forgot much here, is that there are boundaries of what unfettered market produces goods for a few people allowed to be unfettered. So we've forgotten the value of redistributive taxes. We've forgotten the value of infrastructure spending. The roads here are terrible. I'm embarrassed when I fly back from Europe and go to an American airport. It's like going to 1973. You ever seen the trains here? Okay. And we could fix all that with Elon Musk's salary.
And then some.
Right, exactly. So it's not that market outcomes are bad, but they have to be seen as part of an entire, and let me say the last thing, we had the greatest growth of income in the United States over a short period of time, and this is what India can tell you. When the factories opened up and burgeoned in the north, Chicago and Detroit, and there was a great migration of people from the southern part of the United States, came up north to get good jobs. We got the greatest inequality when we told everybody to become an entrepreneur. Think about that. We have not done well when we told everybody to start a company. We did great when we fostered large companies that could employ people. Not everybody wants to start a company.
Over here, please. And then we've got a couple back there.
You could have 3-4 minutes.
All right, go ahead, please.
Yeah. Just wanted to understand from your perspective, right, if you can give examples of the social development things that have worked in the Western countries as well as in some of the developing countries that India can perhaps learn from. And I'm sure you probably are aware that in India, there is this corporate social responsibility, where 2% of the corporate profits that they have to spend, corporations have to spend on social impact. So the question is this something that is the social development to be initiated by NGOs or corporations or the government? So I just want to see some examples, both from developed countries as well as from developing countries that we can learn from.
Who would like to take that?
I'll give it a shot. I'll give it like
And-
1 minute shot.
And then Michael, you might have.
I think so. I think one of the as mentioned, I think it was, I can't remember, it was very like Michael here. He mentioned that in the EU, one of the regulations, like one of the new laws that is coming online, is the fact that every single company would have to report their own ESG activities. Now, I have to say, when I first saw it, I was skeptical because it will just result in compliance, right? Companies just want to actually, comply. So on one occasion, I got a chance to talk to the head of ESG within a very, very big conglomerate in the Balkans. And so I was asking her the question, does it make any sense that you actually have to divert resources to basically just do a compliance on ESG-related activities that your companies actually undertaken? And then to my surprise, her answer was, yes, it's a lot of work. Yes, it may not actually get the company to be fully complied with, the ESG and climate initiatives, but it does actually get the managers and the people within the company to start thinking in that direction. And that in itself is already a very, very big leap forward. So I believe that, like Robert has been mentioning, regulations. I personally do not like regulations, too much regulations, but regulations are actually important. So another thing that I think the US should be doing, allow me, is the fact that should be regulations on social media, right? Just to actually keep it in check, right? Yeah. But yet, for whatever reasons I don't understand, you can probably educate me, is that why is it not in place, right? Why is it not gated, age-gated,
We do study that.
Maybe
In fact,
we
if I
could
can add
take
the
it
two
back to
examples
India, though.
Real quick, two examples that you wanted. One we can say is the United States economic development in the 1960s, when the government spent several $1 trillion on developing missiles to go to the moon and other places. And we spent 2 of every 3 R&D dollars in the 60s in the United States were on missiles in space. And that's why we're sitting here, because we developed the semiconductor and all the computers and all that had to do it. The second one to think about is Japan in the 1860s. They transformed their economy by bankrupting the wealthy people. They took their properties, they bankrupted them, and reallocated. It's still a middle-class country. Yeah. Anyway, those are two.
I would say, too, you can look to some of the NGO work, particularly one of the sponsors of this program, the Gates Foundation. And then in India, a foundation, I'm learning about the Nandi Foundation and what they're doing in terms of bringing the private sector and the public sector together to promote different things. But there's examples. Good. Can we just quickly combine the last? Oh, Michael.
So we made social progress of 500 US cities, 300 England cities. And what we see a clear pattern is, if you want to deliver the good quality jobs and the good social outcomes, get a university. College towns in the US do much better. The worst performing English town that has low unemployment but terrible social progress outcomes doesn't have a university. Universities do seem to be poles of driving good inclusive growth.
Right. Terrific. Can we just combine the 3 questions back there? Just very, very quickly. I've got Amit on my shoulder.
Sorry, I'll... Okay, I just wanted to pull out the gender point really quick, and we can handle that later in the economic panel as well.
There's a microphone. Take the microphone. Please repeat yourself.
Hello, can you hear me? I wanted to really pull out the gender portion. I'm a board advisor for UN Women, and I work in gender equality, equity for a long time. And in your, Michael, in your wonderful social progress index, I would highly suggest we twiddle that a little bit and add gender as a separate criteria? Because I just made one observation that you said in freedom of choice you added in the early marriage, and then later under advanced education, I think I saw a gender equality sub-point.
Okay, so gender. And please, maybe just speak up.
So, thanks for being here. So there's this question that comes again and again, and you guys would already be aware, that whenever people say that India should be taking over the climate change responsibility, although I do know that India is like 8% of the overall carbon emissions, but the per capita carbon emission is like 1/10 of what USA does. And when countries, when they developed economies with a lot of money in their hand, spending that in defense or something like that, suggest that we should work on climate before we work on poverty. I just want to understand what support does countries in EU or USA are willing to give to countries such as India?
So gender and climate change, both emphasis, this country versus India, what India can take from that.
We have exactly 1 minute to close this.
1 minute.
do gender
Let's turn
very
it to Michael, since he's the author of the index, please.
It's a great point. What we've actually tried to do is include a gender indicator for each of the components. And so what we see is actually the mixed picture. Is there are areas of improvement, early marriage has reduced, gender equity outcomes in secondary education have improved, no improvement in domestic violence, no particular improvement in maternal mortality. So there's kind of a mixed picture. The one we're actually developing now, and we'd love to do for India, actually do a women's progress index. And actually you can do that, and then you can look at how the two fit together. And I think that gender dimension is something that's been missing from the conversation, so thank you.
Terrific. I think that's where we'll wind up on that particular note. I thank all four of you very, very much. It was a very active, engaged panel. I'm very appreciative, and thank you all for your participation.